Welcome to the film analysis. Today with Killers of the Flower Moon by Martin Scorsese. Whether Apple is the savior of cinema remains to be seen. In any case, Martin Scorsese was given around $200 million to create Killers of the Flower Moon. This film is currently playing in cinemas, no doubt to qualify for the Oscars, and will soon be available to watch on Apple TV+. Scorsese sticks to cinema, even if he is collaborating with a streaming service here. He wants big pictures, wants to bring them to the big screen. And he does so for 3.5 hours. In this film, we are dealing with true crime. Is this the true crime podcast as a film? Let's go into that later. First, let's note that, in fact, what is being told here is based on a non-fiction book by David Grann. In Fairfax, Oklahoma, the Osage tribe came into considerable wealth. The tribe lived there and suddenly struck a lot of oil. The Osage became very rich, and that certainly aroused the covetousness of the whites. A lot of envy and probably also hatred. Martin Scorsese shows us the land of the Osage in large panoramic shots, somewhat of a late Western. We know these shots from the great Westerns of classical Hollywood, and yet it is not a Western, but above all a swan song to what the Wild West also embraced, namely the incredible exploitation of the Native Americans. We are in the 1920s. Leonardo DiCaprio plays Ernest, returning from the First World War, not quite knowing where to go with himself, and that's why he tries to get a job with his uncle living with the Osage tribe. But all these white men don't seem to work. They mainly marry. Ernest's uncle is a cattle rancher. His name is William Hale, played by Robert De Niro. He speaks the Osage language and comes across as a kind man. Perhaps a bit paternalistic, one would say today, but still his heart seems in the right place. And we know that when people get closer to each other, when they speak each other's language, there can be no such thing as enmity. The enemy is only the friend I don't know yet. But as Scorsese will roll out to us in this film, this very closeness proves to be deadly. The perfidious thing is De Niro is called the king of the Osage Hills here. He functions primarily as a matchmaker. He directs the white men to marry women of the Osage tribe to obtain land rights. The married women are then under the guardianship of the authorities, must apply again and again when they have expenses, and De Niro acts as a matchmaker, but even more, he acts as a murderer. Two of his medics there make sure that the Osage all die an early death. No one lives past the age of 50. Most of them die much earlier, and some of them are simply killed, and the white men frame it as suicide. The Osage woman Mollie, played by Gladstone, doesn't find Ernest clever, but attractive. And Ernest lets his uncle persuade him to marry Mollie. At the same time, he is a little taken with her. Yes, he is a little bit in love. He also wants to live a life of wealth, to have expensive cars and live in a modern house. One by one, the Osage are killed. Gradually, they are poisoned. There is no great aggression in the process. The perpetrators and victims don't just live next to each other, they even live with each other, a closeness rendering the film's atmosphere eerie. So there are very clear antagonists, but they are not recognizable to the Osage. And only through our prior knowledge can we see these antagonists, but we can't really believe it ourselves as the feelings that Ernest and William express remain ambivalent, leaving one permanently confused. Even though their action should be clear to us, often when we see the film, we don't want to admit it. The film certainly carries its weaknesses. The images are perfect, but perhaps lean too much on classical Hollywood. The film focuses too much on these wide panoramic shots, many interior scenes featuring shot counter shot, triggering a certain boredom in the viewer. And surely we also witnessed a problem with later works here. A director like Martin Scorsese lets his work fray a bit, and a clearer dramaturgy would certainly have been important here. Although this is not meant to be a criticism of the actual suspense dramaturgy, which doesn't want to be suspenseful. The film is a litany. Repetition is the principle. People die again and again. The film is a requiem from beginning to end. Redundancy is the form principle, and the creeping death is shown in a special way, because we expect the event in a Western. But here these deaths do occur, but Scorsese doesn't stage them eventfully. There are no massive conflicts, no action scenes. And when we think about dramaturgy, but also about historical processes or the like, we always think in terms of big, sudden events. Slow death is very difficult for us to imagine, although it is so important to grasp it as well. Let's think of climate change, which is not a comet strike and then suddenly everything is over, but precisely climate change creeping on us poses the danger we fail to recognize. The film also features a crime thriller element, namely Tom White, played by Jesse Plemons, appears. He belongs to the newly formed FBI, and he is supposed to investigate what happened to the Osage tribe. The founding story of the FBI could be told, but Scorsese is not particularly interested in it. He doesn't even hide his unwillingness. Tom White only gets 15 minutes of screen time. Leonardo DiCaprio, on the other hand, plays his perhaps most interesting role. What kind of character is this? Well, it's simple-minded, it's brash, it's sensitive, it's dishonest, it's self-centered, and this character is also pathetically opportunistic. And if we are perhaps waiting for something like catharsis, after all, Scorsese doesn't let that happen. This Ernest remains a pathetic figure, and that leaves us with the question, how do we deal with this character? At first we can identify with him as he comes across as someone unexceptional, and our connection to the character is also improved by the fact that it is played by DiCaprio. But the opposite of identification means anonymity. And we don't really know how this character thinks inside. Maybe there is no great inner process. Maybe it's just pure opportunism. There's no empathy cinema here. Scorsese has always put bad characters who behave impossibly at the center of his films. And we are not just talking about anti-heroes or outlaws, but also terribly annoying characters like in Mean Streets. Scorsese always knew how to draw figures from the bad guys that fascinate us. And this power of cinema has its pitfalls. Take The Wolf of Wall Street. Jordan Belfort is not a good guy, but the way DiCaprio plays him, he still fascinates us. We experience something different this time. DiCaprio plays a bad person, but this character is not in any way interesting, diabolical. It is of outrageous ordinariness. That is something new in Scorsese's oeuvre. And the sinister truth depicted in the 3.5 hours is embodied especially by De Niro as William Hale, who chooses a very typical speech both to the Osage and to his nephew. Repeatedly he says, yes, it's all about keeping the family together. Think about it. When some family members die, you are going to inherit more. It's always about thinking as a family. That's the way he talks to everyone. De Niro always appears as the voice of reason. That's the healthy middle. Now, let's not get upset. It's really a sad incident again. And yet, it's very clear what he's doing here. He defends only his logic, the logic of profit. It's remarkable, anyway, that inheritance law is a remnant of feudalism under capitalism. And we see embodied by De Niro a capitalism that no longer needs to make a noise. It can kill quietly. The Osage are the victims. Resistance is hardly possible for them because they don't know what's happening to them. One alcoholic among them sways a little, but she is then very quickly pushed out of the way. Death comes so quietly that the Osage don't even notice it. Or rather, they can't defend themselves against it because the antagonists seem like friends. And that too is a principle of capitalism, strangulation through embrace. And we experience such a comforting embrace in both William and Ernest. It is therefore a loud and at the same time silent film. We, the audience, must relate to this film. We love to see DiCaprio and De Niro, and we love it when they play villains. Scorsese makes this impossible in this film. That means we, the audience, must become active. We must become rivals, the rivals of DiCaprio and De Niro. How does the film relate to us? Is this a historical epic reworking an important, hitherto a forgotten history for us, also for a mass audience? No, there is a calm indifference. We don't see fundamentalists driven by hatred, shouting. This calm indifference may be called bourgeois cruelty, seen everywhere when people must live in housing containers working for us. When we close the borders and we say that's reasonable, we also must provide a bit of security. Then we adopt the same De Niro tone. And when we hear that most of the Osage don't live past 50, then we've arrived at the life expectancy of Nigeria or Somalia. And we also know how much hard work and poverty reduce life expectancy in capitalism. We simply accept this as well. And of course, Killers of the Flower Moon relates heavily to climate change. After all, it is about the oil industry. And we must ask ourselves, aren't we all like Ernest? Probably very few resemble William Hale, acting disturbing poison, finishing people off. Crucially, in William Hale's actions, other white men help him. Ernest features in a love story impressively already in the 1920s, a love transcending ethnic boundaries. A white man marries a woman from a tribe carrying progressive aspects, but Ernest is someone who at the same time may not share his uncle's sinister intentions but supports them in his actions. And he is clearly also the perpetrator, but also in an intimate, loving relationship with Mollie, whom he finally kills. He represents a murderous accomplice, and this complicity, which we also carry within us every day, becomes visible to us here on the screen. We see in a mirror. The last third of the film contains a somewhat very lengthy court case, and there is nothing left to clarify. We viewers know what's going on anyway. It is no longer a question of singling out a perpetrator in a special way, but rather of recognizing the system of indifference, profit interests, social Darwinism, racism, and emotional dishonesty. And it's amazing how this Ernest doesn't even have the courage to at least own up to his actions until the very end. So Scorsese doesn't tell a white savior story. And the director doesn't want to appear as the white savior either. A circumstance also explaining the ending, which we must spoil here. In 1932, the then fledgling FBI, which investigated the Osage cases, started a radio program called the Lucky Strike Hour. This radio show, an early form of true crime podcast, worked FBI cases into dramatic form and handed them out to the mass audience. All done even back then with the cooperation of J. Edgar Hoover. And one episode addressed the Osage murders. These shows were also told with a horror factor, with FBI heroism, as true crime podcasts are told today, but Martin Scorsese criticizes the genre quite clearly. The film ends with us suddenly being in this radio show, how the recordings take place there, how a band creates tension again and again with a drum roll and then wants to tell an insanely exciting story about these murders. In the culture industry, Scorsese shows us here, everything becomes entertainment. And you can't criticize Killers of the Flower Moon for not being entertaining. The film tries to escape this logic. At the same time, however, this is a film rendered possible by cannibalizing, exploiting, whatever you want to call it, these Osage murders. As Scorsese is aware of that, he establishes another plot level. If it didn't fit dramaturgically in the radio program at the time, they just cut out a few victims. Mollie's story was simply ignored at the time, as Scorsese tells himself, who makes a cameo appearance at the end of the film. As gimmicky as the band in the radio studio is, with the flourishes to make the Osage murders entertaining, that's how Hollywood cinema works too. And Scorsese knows that. He also decided himself to create star cinema here. Yes, it's an impressive performance by Lily Gladstone, but above all, DiCaprio and De Niro once again take center stage. The film deliberately takes the perpetrator's perspective. However, we don't see anything heroic, but little rotten guys. Scorsese doesn't try to puncture his work, but expands it cleverly. And once again, the Osage story is exploited for fiction, for cinema. The director also appears here as a perpetrator. Scorsese has the last word. The contradiction of making a film out of the Osage tribe, of making a business out of it, cannot be resolved. One can only reflect on this contradiction. The film shows its own exploitation of reality, so that we don't watch but see. It would be nice if you would like to support the film analysis financially. You can do so via my bank account or PayPal. Also, you can find me on Patreon. Thank you very much.